Okay, I hope you can all hear me okay. So first of all, thank you so much to all the organizers, Essie, Stephen, and Carrie too, for organizing this session, and thank you all for this opportunity to speak to you about our research. So this work was conducted jointly with my amazing co-authors, Tan Chibo, who is currently at the IMF, and Xiaopu Zhang, who is at Peking University and IFPRI. Right, so this is going to be an empirical paper that I'll be presenting. And in the context of this gathering, I think you should view it as an example of a humble one, of quasi-experimental approaches aimed at understanding events that potentially have multi-generational consequences. So in terms of this work, it's nested in this literature and the fetal origins hypothesis that talks about how early insults have long-run consequences. So in this paper, we're going to consider a particular shock, a really large shock in the context of China. And the focus is going to be on rural China. The natural experiment, which is the Great Chinese Famine of 1959 to 61, is a very well-studied event at this point. But what we're going to do is we're going to ask whether this shock has resulted in negative impacts on a particular outcome variable that affects human capital accumulation, and that would be cognitive skills, as measured by achievement tests. In this case, in particular, a math test, and we'll also talk about a word recognition test, as a robustness check. I think sorry, something came up on my screen. Importantly, our data is also going to allow us to examine whether the effects of these shocks on the first generation are going to persist in the next generation, so the children of famine survivors. And we're going to be paying particular attention to differential impacts across gender types and also family structures. And that will allow us, hopefully, to say something about the potential mechanisms that explain this pattern of intergenerational transmission. So the mechanism that we're going to explore is going to be son preference, and I'll talk more about this in a while. So in terms of the data, we're going to be looking at a household panel survey, otherwise known as the China Family Panel Studies, or CFPS. The approach that we're going to take is difference in differences. And what I'm going to do in this talk is I'm going to emphasize our main findings. I really want to talk about the mechanism, but I will detail the robustness checks that we engaged in. Right. So in terms of the broader impact of our work, I think our work also contributes to this large and emerging literature that's looking at the impact of climate change. So things like extreme variability in terms of precipitation, wind events, and so on. And the consequences of this sort of variability, on vulnerable populations, like in developing countries. So to the extent that these early shocks do drive sustained, persistent intergenerational impacts, that could have worrying consequences for intergenerational outcomes, economic mobility in developing countries. Right. So let me provide a quick executive summary of our findings. So it's going to turn out that the negative impacts of the famine are going to be borne primarily by women in our sample, in both generations. So the pattern's going to look like that. So in the first generation, so what we think of as survivor effects, we're going to find negative impacts on female survivors of the famine, and no negative impacts on male survivors. Now, in terms of the second generation, we're going to find negative impacts on the daughters, but the daughters of male famine survivors. All right, so if we term them like famine fathers, it's their daughters who experience negative impacts, not their sons. Now, the magnitude of the impacts are also quite sizable in this particular sample. So in terms of the impact on the first generation females, so the female famine survivors, a 1 standard deviation increase in our famine intensity measure will result in about a 5.9% difference in terms of scores between the female survivors who have been impacted and the control group. The corresponding impact for daughters of famine fathers is going to be larger at about 10%. Now, so in terms of thinking about a mechanism, and we are pushing very hard to think of one, the challenge that we face, I think you can see, is that there does not appear to be, any intergenerational impact for the survivor group for which impact was observed on. So the children of famine mothers aren't actually impacted. On the other hand, it is the survivor group for which no impact was observed, famine fathers, whose children are impacted. And in that case, only their daughters and not their sons. So what we're going to do is we're going to explore a son preference mechanism. And the reason for this is that, first of all, there's ample evidence of this in the particular context that we're examining, and to see if we can, push this particular mechanism to explain our findings. So the main idea is that some preferences may be expressed in families of more than one child. They can only be expressed in families of more than one child. So when we look at the second generation outcomes, we're going to consider different family types. So families with one child, family with multiple kids, and in particular families with multiple kids that have both sons and daughters. And what we're going to find is that we don't find any negative impact on children of one-child families whose fathers were born in a famine. But we do find a negative impact for daughters in families with multiple children. So, with daughters and sons, I mean. And so that's going to be how we are going to propose that a reasonable mechanism might be son preference. All right, so that's a summary of what I'm going to, the story that I'm going to build. So let's go into the details of the paper. Right, so just a very quick background, first just introduce the literature, and also, just nest our work in terms of this literature. Very briefly, what does the literature mean by cognitive skills, and why is the development of cognitive skills an issue of importance? So cognitive skills have been associated with measures of general intelligence like IQ and G factors, and the G factor, and it's been measured in different ways. You can employ cognitive assessment tests, and that have been done in a variety of settings, in terms of the Dutch famine, for instance, in terms of Ghana, shameless plug for my paper, and also in China by a paper by Chih, whom I'll be talking quite a lot about, and also in terms of achievement tests. And so our work is going to focus on achievement tests, as I said, a math test in particular. Now, the importance of cognitive skills has also been demonstrated in this literature, according to a wide variety of within a wide variety of dimensions. So for individual outcomes, for instance, cognitive skills have been shown to have a substantial role to play in human capital formation, and in terms of determining individual schooling and labor market outcomes. It's been looked at in terms of economic growth. So Hanushak and Walsman have highlighted the role of cognitive skills in economic growth, for instance. Recent work has also suggested that the intergenerational transmission of cognitive skills and non-cognitive skills too may be important in terms of explaining intergenerational mobility. So the work by Blandon, for instance, by Blandon, for instance, has, using the British cohort study, shows that cognitive skills, for instance, explains about 27% of intergenerational income persistence. There is more broadly also substantial evidence using very high quality data for the intergenerational persistence of cognitive skills. So work by Sandy and Shell, for instance, have shown this in the context of Norwegian military data. And in other contexts, Sweden and Germany, this point has also been shown. So we should note that the question that we're examining in this paper is a little different. So we're not talking about whether cognitive skills exhibit persistence across generations necessarily. Instead, what we're asking about is whether any sort of early shocks actually exhibit persistence. So in this sense, our work is related to a line of research that talks about the multi-generational persistence of such shocks, and has been taken in the literature, for example, to be evidence for a epigenetic transmission mechanism. So a particularly influential body of work, that uses historical harvest and church registry data from a region in northern Sweden. This particular line of work finds evidence for such lines of transmission, and in particular have argued that the lines of shock transmission is gender specific. So nutritional shocks to paternal grandfathers in years just before adolescence becomes associated with lower mortality risks for grandsons. And corresponding shocks to paternal grandmothers results in similar risks to granddaughters. All right, so in comparison to this work, our shocks are going to occur earlier, not in adolescence, but in early childhood and in utero. And we're going to study 2 generations and not multiple generations. And we do find evidence for shocks between generations, but the transmission of shocks is not gender specific. So again, I will postpone the discussion of our mechanism, but uh, we think that a simpler context specific explanation and mechanism might be appropriate. So in terms of the natural experiment that we'll be studying, as I said, the Great Chinese Famine of 1959 to 61. So this was a very severe famine where 30 million people, it has been estimated that about 30 million people have died. What is important is that the mortality rates varied dramatically and was centered, and the impact of the famine was basically centered on rural areas. So if we look at across provinces, municipalities, and autonomous regions, you see that the variation in terms of the impact as measured by excess mortality, so the difference between mortality rates during the famine period and against trend, it varied widely. Now, it was most heavily felt in rural areas because of actual policy initiatives that led to preferential supply of foods, so food supplies being diverted to urban areas away from rural areas. And so in that sense, we will focus on the rural areas, but this fact about urban areas being spared the effects of the famine will suggest a natural falsification test, which we will exploit. So the geographic distribution of famine severity is also quite interesting. So the famine was widespread, but there was large variation across regions. And in particular, the high severity areas corresponded to areas where you had relatively high per capita grain output. So provinces like Anhui, Henan, and Sichuan. And these were also the areas that transferred more grain to the other areas via central government direction before the famine, so before 1958, but suffered steep reductions in grain production during the famine years. So when I discuss the robustness checks, we're going to exploit some of these historical and institutional features of the famine context to suggest robustness exercises, for instance, a instrumental variable approach. So in the interest of time, I'd like to skip a a detailed discussion of the causes of the famine. So let's just say that the famine was thought to be due to a combination of weather-related shocks as well as policies from the Great Leap Forward. But in our reading of the literature, the weight of the literature places the bulk of the responsibility on the latter. So government policies at that time. So in fact, a lot of authors are just going to refer to this famine as the Great Leap Forward famine, right? And again, the fact that it is because of policy will allow us to think of particular identification strategies. Okay, so let me talk about our data. So the data that we're going to utilize is from the China Family Panel studies. So this was constructed to be a nationally representative longitudinal survey of Chinese families. So it started in 2010 and was followed up. 15,000 families were surveyed in the baseline year. It covered 25 provinces, municipalities, and regions. So we're just going to term all of this provinces in terms of our discussion. And it excludes basically a bunch of autonomous regions. So in the 2010 wave, we're going to have math and word recognition tests, and it's going to be deployed to all members in the households that were surveyed. All right, so our first generation sample, so remember that this is the generation that is within the the famine window, and also in our control group, which I'll discuss in more detail later, is about 3,000. And the number of children that they have will be about 1,000. And the age of the second generation that we're going to look at are going to be between 16 to 30 years at the time of the survey, so around 2010. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the kind of achievement test questions that were given. So the math, the structure of the word test is going to reflect the structure of the math test. So the way this was done was questions were prearranged from easiest to hardest. So the easiest math questions, the hardest math questions. And the way the interviewer was scored was the interviewee was scored was the number of the last question that they could answer correctly. And so the interviewer would go to interviewee, and depending on that person's educational level, would start at a particular number. If that person failed to answer that particular question, then it would be that number -1. Otherwise, they'll proceed with the sequence of questions, and they will stop at the ranking of the question that the interviewee was able to answer correctly. All right, so that's the nature of the achievement test that was undertaken. Okay, and right. So in terms of our empirical strategy, it's going to be difference and differences. So in terms of our treatment and control groups, so first of all, YI is going to be the test score for an individual. Higher scores are going to be better. In terms of our treatment and control groups, for the first generation, the treatment group is going to be the people who were born in 1959 and 1961, and the control group will be 1963 to 1965 birth cohorts. Now, the second generation merits a little more discussion. So the treatment group will be if you're a child of a father or a mother who was born in 1959, 1961, okay, or if you are born to a family to parents, both of whom were not in the famine period, okay. Now, the parental spouse of the treatment group, in our case, was never born in 1959 to 1961. So it's really a very, very small number of, in our sample, of kids who were born to fathers and moms, both of whom were born during the famine period. All right, so that's very, very small number of kids was excluded from this particular analysis. Okay, so in terms of the treatment itself, that would be excess mortality, and this is taken from Lin and Yang 2000. And this is again the difference between the highest mortality rates at the provincial level during the famine period against trend, which is the average mortality rate during 1956 to 1958. Now, in terms of controls, so we ran exercises with controls, and you can see that those are the first generation controls, and the second generation would add a different set of controls, for instance, like parental age differences, parental education levels, and so on. But because the emphasis of this particular work is really on second generational outcomes, it was clearly argued that these controls may themselves be influenced by the treatment variable itself, especially for the second generation. And so, we also ran parsimonious specifications with no covariates. So in this case, we just have like region fixed effects and or where we add the age controls for the second generation. Okay, so that's the setup that we have.
Chih Ming, can I ask you a question about the regional fixed effects?
Yes.
I thought there was province level heterogeneity in the governance. In other words, that in some cases the provincial leaders were unwilling to even admit the existence of a famine because of adherence, whereas in others there was a willingness to ignore the dictates of the central government. Did you explore that?
Yeah. So the fixed effects are at the province level.
Oh, okay. So okay.
Yeah. Sorry. So I use the terms interchangeably because the 25 provinces that are not actually termed provinces. So it's really provinces, municipalities, autonomous regions, and so on. But we mean like fixed effects at that level.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Sorry.
Oh no. Thanks.
Sorry, since you were already stopped, I might as well.
Sure.
And tell me if I'm jumping the gun, but you said that there's no difference between that there's a difference between urban and rural, that urban wasn't exposed,
Yes.
essentially.
Yes, that's
So
what I said. Yeah.
couldn't you do triple differences using that as additional control, like diff?
Oh, yes, yes. I think that's a great idea. We didn't do that, but
Okay.
that's something that we should certainly explore. Yeah,
Oh, okay.
that's great. Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, so in terms of, so let me now transition to talking about the uh, the first generation results. So, in terms of the impact of the famine on survivors, so the first generation, the literature has documented many such impacts across a range of outcomes. So in an important recent work, Lee and Lume, 2017, they provided a comprehensive survey and meta-analysis of almost 40 studies, I think, on the long-term health impact of early life exposure to Chinese famine. And they do find that you see effects on a range of health outcomes like being overweight, type 2 diabetes, hyperglycemia, metabolic syndrome, schizophrenia, on adults who were affected by the famine compared to the control group who were born after the famine. So our closest, the work that's closest to ours is actually Xi 2017. So their study uses data from 2011, from the 2011 and 2013 waves of Charles, which is the equivalent of the Chinese equivalent of our HRS, and employs prefectural level, county level changes in cohort sizes as their famine measure. And they do find that famine has an impact on a range of cognitive assessment tests for survivors. So in a sense, that's going to be something that our work is consistent with. So the difference is our study is differentiated by the fact that we emphasize gender-specific impacts, and that we're really looking at the impacts on on the second generation, so the offspring of survivors, which is not something that they do. So in terms of our first generation findings, so this is what we have. And I want to actually, connect with a point that another presenter, I think it was C, who made that, who talked about, impacts in terms of marriage, right? So selection into marriage and childbearing. So because we were thinking about the second generation impact, we tried to pay some attention to that. So first of all, in terms of characterizing this, we only have statistically significant negative impacts for female survivors, no statistically significant impacts for male survivors. And because, and so we also looked at survivors, all survivors, married survivors, and married survivors who went on to have kids. And we don't notice significantly differently negatively affected survivors being sorted into any of these groups. All right, so that's one thing that we saw. So as a robustness check, we also used a measure of cognitive disability from the China National Survey of Disabled People in 2006. So this is just larger. They have much larger samples. And so we wanted to use that for a robustness check. Now, the outcome measure is different, of course. It's not about cognitive performance, but really about serious mental disability, for instance, retardation. But of course, as I said, the sample size is larger. But when we carried out the exercises, we do find similar qualitative effects, all right, using a larger sample. So good for a robustness check. So let me now talk about the focus of our work, which is, the second generation impact. So there is a emerging body of work that has found health impacts from the famine, from this particular famine on the second generation. So the body of work isn't large, but it is certainly emerging. So across a wide range of, typically health outcomes. So for instance, Feng and Ha found that you had lower height for weight and height for age and weight for age for children born to famine survivors. Sung found that you had mothers with prenatal famine exposure had significant negative impacts on child's, infant mortality risks. Kim found reduced secondary school enrollment by about 5 to 7 percentage points for the children of famine survivors. And Lee and Ann found that children with both parents born in the famine are significantly shorter. Both boys and girls are significantly shorter. All right. And in a very recent work, Cheng et al. Found that prenatal and early life exposure increased the risk of acute pulmonary tuberculosis, both in the exposed generation and also to their offspring. and so they concluded that it could be a combination of both in-house transmission, within household transmission, I mean, and also increases in just susceptibility. So to our knowledge, no studies have examined the intergenerational impact on cognitive skills in China. So the intergenerational impact, she of course had done the single generational impact. So most of the empirical studies on intergenerational transmissions, like the ones that you see here, also do not think about gender-specific transmission. And our contention is that without doing so, it reduces your ability to think of a mechanism for explaining the effects. So in terms of the results, a simple way to visualize our main findings is just to look at the trend. And here, we're looking at really simple DID. So, we're looking at, we classify regions as being severe or, less severe, where severity is about being at or above the median excess mortality. All right. And so what you see here is you see this jump for girls born to fathers who were in the famine period, right? And not for like for boys. So that is the that is what we show. All right. So that's the negative difference. Okay. So we don't see any such patterns when we look at the children of famine mothers. All right. And so that's the other thing. So this is going to be borne out in our formal results. So these results, and those are the formal results that we have. So as you can see, when we look at the samples of boys and girls, it's really the girls of famine fathers who are going to be impacted. And for famine mothers, we don't have that kind of impact. Okay, so, and this is going to be qualitatively similar if we look at a parsimonious specification or one with covariates. So in terms of the magnitude from our baseline parsimonious specification, we're going to find that an increase in famine intensity by 1 standard deviation will lead to about a 9.6% difference in math scores between daughters of famine fathers and those whose fathers were born afterwards. Okay. All right. So with the time that I have, I'm going to talk a little bit about robustness checks, and then I'll talk a little bit about the mechanism. So in terms of robustness checks, so we did, standard checks. So we looked we examined to make sure that there was no pre-existing differences in trend in terms of trends in math scores based on famine severity. So before famine severity, so no difference in pre-existing pre-treatment trends. I have discussed the placebo tests that we used with the urban sample. So we ran this for children of parents who were born in those time periods, but who were living in urban areas. We also, did a placebo test for children of parents who were born after the famine period, right? So we got like false treatment groups in effect. Okay, and again, our results are robust to these placebo tests. Now, a concern, so there are a wide variety of concerns, one of which is in terms of migration. So this has been addressed, in quite a lot of studies that look at the Chinese famine. Now, the main concern is that the observed residents of the sample in 2010 might not have been born in the same place. And this problem really has two facets. So migration of parents or migration of children. Now, the literature is going to argue that the migration for parents may not be such an issue because internal migration in China was rare before 1980, only started really increasing in the 1990s But even then, the proportion of migrants, from the population was no more than 10%. So, and the mean age was in the mid 20s. So by 2010, these that cohort is old enough so that this is unlikely to bias our findings. But the migration of children potentially poses a challenge for our baseline analysis. So if cognitively higher functioning children tend to migrate to urban areas, then the observed rural sample may be composed of cognitively weaker children, and that may exaggerate the negative impact of the famine. So it's potentially the case. Now, fortunately, so what the CFPS does is that it tracks down the children of these families. And it also registers if they are living where their parents or their family are residing. And so what we do is that we drop the sample for whom, their place of residence is different from their place of origin. And we find that our results are robust to that. Now, in terms of endogeneity, so as I mentioned, so it's one thing to maybe argue that our that our famine shock, excess mortality, may be thought of as an exogenous shock for the first generation, but that may not be the case. You can argue that that wouldn't be the case for the second generation, for example. So we wanted to address this concern about endogeneity. And for this, what we're going to do is we're going to propose a instrumental variable that is historically based on the incentive structure for provincial governors at that time. So the idea goes back to what we saw in terms of the geographic distribution of famine severity. So as I said, the most severely affected areas were the high grain production areas that transferred more grain to the other areas before the famine, and then saw steep declines in grain production. So what the literature suggests is the story that provincial governors were incentivized to inflate grain output figures. So it gave them better career advancement prospects by giving pleasing news to the central government. But the result of inflating these figures was that the central government then asked for higher levels of grain procurement, so excessive grain procurement that led to more severity in famine conditions in those locations. All right. So in other studies like Li and Yang and Kung and Cheng, they have shown that the birthplace of the governor might be correlated with famine severity. And presumably because if the governor has strong local ties, first of all, he would have potentially better information about the actual degree of famine in his province. At the same time, if he has strong local ties, he may also be able to get away with things like counterfeiting output information, and to be able to actually carry out these activities that would cause a higher level of severity of famine in that particular province.
Professor,
So
you have
that,
about 2 minutes.
yes. Oh, right. Okay. So we're going to use the dummy variable denoting birthplace for, the provincial governor as being as the one that was the province that was for which he was in charge in, and that's going to be our IV. Our results going to be robust to that, but in a test for exogeneity, so we find no evidence for endogeneity under the assumption that that IV is valid. All right. So I would try to answer other questions, potentially using the robustness checks. Now, let me talk about sun preference. Okay, so the idea behind our mechanism is that sun preference is probably the most simple and most direct explanation in this particular context. So we can model sun preference potentially and its impact on investment decisions using, for instance, Heckman-Mosso 2014. And other work have argued that since boys are more vulnerable to shocks in early childhood, male survivors are more likely to be observed in families with stronger sun preference. So the idea is that if the famine fathers are in families with strong sun preferences, that may get passed on to that particular first generation, who then exhibit these sun preferences when they deal with their children in terms of their investment allocation choices. Okay, so how are we going to examine this? So we're going to look at families where you have just one child versus multiple children So in one-child families, we do not find that children have significantly worse outcomes than the control group, right? So if you're in a one-child family, there is no margin for you to reallocate across your children. You just have one kid. Okay, so in fact, daughters do better. So it is the families with multiple children where daughters actually do worse. Now, we dug a little further and we looked at basically families that have at least one son and one daughter. So that's what family type means. So family type equals one implies that a family has both sons and daughters within it. And when we look at that, that's where we see the negative impact on girls. It's for those particular families, or rather, more severe impacts. Okay, so with the time that I have, let me just conclude. So we find negative second generation effects, but the good news is that, well, the good news is that they do not appear to be broad-based in the sense that, for instance, the children of famine mothers do not appear to be severely impacted. So it is possible, at least that's one thing that we're trying to find for, that the negative impacts on the daughters of famine fathers are due to a context-specific mechanism that applies to the case of China. So son preference. So not to some more global, more deeper biological mechanism, for instance, epigenetics. Also, if the experiences of the daughters of the famine fathers reflect those of the female famine survivors, remember that there was no impact. There was no impact on their children. Then perhaps any negative effects on the daughters of famine fathers may not also be passed along to their children. So, in this season where we class for possibilities for levity, I would say that in this particular sense, our paper suggests that the effects of even very large shocks may have only limited impact intergenerationally, and that could be an optimistic message for vulnerable populations in developing countries who are likely to experience a lot of these shocks going forward because of issues like climate change. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chih Ming. So let me ask a provocative question, maybe provocative. The finding that the effects of the famine did not extend to two generations. What do you think the role of government policy was?
That it did not.
Yes, you're thinking of two generations in which the second generation is in a very different society than the previous ones. In other words, you think about the expansion of medical care, educational opportunities, so on and so forth.
Yeah, so I think so in one sense, it's good that we're looking at rural China. So one of the issues that will arise in terms of government policy in China, maybe for instance the one-child policy, right? Okay, so that might be something that is of concern. So the one-child policy really only started in 1979. And even then it was modified by the mid 1980s to allow like rural parents to have a second child if their first one was a daughter. And there are documented ways of, what people have tried to get around these, that sort of policy. Now, because it started in 1979, it's not really going to apply to the kids in either of these groups. Remember, the oldest kid is 30 years old at 2010. So, so that particular policy, probably not. But what about the Cultural Revolution and the kind of policies that were enacted during the Cultural Revolution? Well, all the first generation, so in this case, all the first generation and second generation, everyone in our sample really was going to be impacted by the Cultural Revolution. That was from 1966 to 76. All right, in the sense that their parents of the second generation were born before that, and they were born after that. All right, so they're born before they lived through it, and then the kids came after the second revolution, the Cultural Revolution, but they had to deal with parents who have lived through that. Okay, so that may be maybe that policies regarding the Cultural Revolution will have an impact in terms of, for instance, preferences of how to allocate investments across children. But yeah, it's something that we'll have to think deeper about. Yeah.
A quick A quick
Just to make a
comment.
follow. Yeah, go ahead.
No, Stephen, you follow up.
I just wanted, so you said the people were born in the final generation is born around 1980.
Yes, that's right. Yep.
Okay, and I get maybe that's part of what I'm trying to ask is that in thinking about intergenerational mobility against a background in which one of the generations comes of age in historically unprecedented aggregate economic growth, it just strikes me, again, pushing this a little bit harder and going beyond specifics of government policy, it strikes me as an interesting thing to think about how you would look for the footprint of persistence if the system the society collectively becomes much more affluent.
Oh yeah. Oh, I see your point. So I think that is,
Essie touched on some of these issues about looking at distribution versus changes in aggregate levels, but it strikes me there's something even beyond that. There's a profound non-stationarity in the kind of data.
Yeah, no, that's right. And actually, I was going to ask Essie that, but I didn't think we really had time. In terms of the measures of mobility that he was proposing, so China's a very special case, as Steve brought up. So from the 80s, you don't think of the growth rates, as being anywhere close to steady state. I would imagine. So one of the strengths, I think, maybe, of a study like that is that we're not trying to focus on incomes, but we're trying to focus on particular attributes and characteristics that would underlie, economic performance, right? So cognitive skills, right? So something more long-ranging. So to the extent that have more long-ranging impacts, to the extent that we're able to characterize how such skills, persist, and also if shocks, are persistent in terms of how they impact these skills, that may give us better insight into, long-run trends of intergenerational mobility than perhaps looking at just earnings outcomes. So I don't know if that's that directly answers your question, Steve.
Outcomes are outcomes. I was more focused on more mundane things. Some of the changes, impacts that you discovered were in the range of 5-6%, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I'm talking about sort of economic significance rather than statistical. So one worry I have about that, because I see that as very small, is your dependent variable is a categorical ordered, right? These are scores, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so there's an interpretation issue. The percentages you find can be interpreted as impact on the probability of these changes rather than the actual outcomes, actual cognitive outcomes. And given the usual nitpicking and stuff about what if you had done a model in which you don't do this, these are linear probability models in effect that you run. If you were to do polycotomous type models for categorical variables, what might happen to these 5-6 percentages would be interesting.
Right. Yeah, that's certainly something that we would follow up on. So the other thing is, I think I may have misspoken. So they're not raw scores that we're using; they're log scores. So I'm not sure if that changes the your comments.
It's a nice trick. It doesn't really change the nature of the outcome variable that you're looking. These are polycotomous ordered outcomes. The log will maintain the orderedness. It might take care of the digit issue, but not so much the orderedness.
Certainly, thank you.
I have a quick question.
I have a comment. So I think the 1959 to 1961 cohort has some unique experiences, not only in terms of the Great Famine, but also their experiences during the Cultural Revolution, because when the Cultural Revolution started in 1966, they happened to be at age 7, which means that their formal education experiences since elementary school would be destroyed, probably more severely compared to earlier or later cohorts. And also when the reopening of colleges during the end of the Cultural Revolution in 1976, so many of them took part in the college exam, but the competition was more severe compared to later cohorts. So I wonder whether the results you show in terms of their math skills may be partly related to their other experiences that affect their formal education.
Yeah, so what we can say is that all of our, first generation were born before the Cultural Revolution, right? So they all went through it. And you're right. So our oldest would have just started, I think, primary schooling basically at the start of the Cultural Revolution. So we're not going to be able to separate out, I don't think, the impact of the Cultural Revolution on our treatment and control groups separately. So if there was regional variation in terms of how, the policies for the Cultural Revolution were applied, that may be captured in terms of, the kind of region fixed effects that we had at that time. So, but outside of that, I'm not sure that I can address that. It's a good point, though.
Thank
Just
you.
a very, very quick one. So when you're looking at the martyrs who were born during the famine period, because how many observations do you have compared to the one that fathers were born during the famine?
Oh, yeah. So we have slightly more mothers than fathers, I think, if that's what you're asking. Yeah. Here. So we are going to have about, 1,400 and about 1,400 males.
The reason why I asked is because you said that you actually exclude those parents who both were born during the famine, right? And in this sample, when mothers who were born during the famine, that means the father probably is not. And that means the mother are typically older than the fathers.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand that. So can you say that again? So these are famine survivors you're talking about, right?
Yeah, so because you exclude those parents who, both of them who were born during the famine, right?
Yes.
So that means if you're looking at the martyrs who were born in the famine, that means the fathers probably were not.
Okay, so for the first generation, I don't exclude anyone. So
look at the second generation.
right.
So if the mothers were born during the famine, that means fathers are not, because you exclude those who were born.
Who both were born. Yeah.
Exactly, right? That means in the sample of mothers who were born during the famine, that means fathers are not, and the fathers are typically younger than the mothers.
The fathers do not have to be younger than the mothers. They could be older. They just shouldn't be born within the famine period.
Oh, so they're not. So the fathers are not limited to the who are born after.
No. So they could be, so long as they're not born within 59 to 61. They can be born outside of 59 to 61. So, and maybe a better answer would be, we also look at the difference in mothers and fathers' ages. Is that something that you're trying to get at?
Yeah.
So that's something that we control for as well, in terms of our covariates. So I think that's what you're asking. So I apologize. So I wasn't clear. So all I mean is that the parental spouses were not born during this period. They don't have to be born after the period.
Exactly, because this actually compared to your first generation treatment variable that you have is a little bit different, right? Because in the first generation, the treatment is really whether or not you experience or not. And
Yes.
the second generation, the treatment actually becomes a mix. If you experience during the, whether or not you were born during the famine, but the control group actually can include both parents who experienced the famine but were not born during that period. and those people who actually were not born and not experienced at all.
That's true. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
I was thinking about if you refine that sort of the control group that you have, I was wondering what kind of impact you may get, because that would become more comparable in terms of first and second generations.
No, I agree. But do you think that parental difference in ages, if we control for that, that would take care of that?
Because right now, I think to me is that you in the control group, you actually have some of the parents who actually experience it.
No.
Even though they were not born, but
Yeah.
they,
So right.
in terms of they're not born during that period, but they could actually experience it during the very early childhood. So they were
Right.
affected as well. So I was wondering whether or not that would be a good definition of the control group of yours.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me think a little bit about that. Thank you.
Yeah.